Hi guys, so today we're going to talk about inflammation and its role in depression. Um, and this is going to be really connected to the cytokine hypothesis. So yet another hypothesis of what could be happening in the brain that leads to depression. So first we're just going to kind of do a nice refresher of what is an inflammatory response, what happens, that kind of thing. As well as talk about what innate immunity means in terms of the brain. So, inflammation is one of the main immune responses. So, when you get sick or injured, then one of the very first immune responses is always inflammation. And so you can see that a lot in skin problems where you'll see redness or some swelling. You see that a lot in, say, sunburns. Super easy to see that inflammation. And that's why things like ibuprofen work, because ibuprofen reduces inflammation. So it reduces that pain and also the inflammatory response of the immune system. So the inflammation results from a disruption of homeostasis. So in other words, just a change from how normal things are, again due to infection, damage, or even stress. So this is where us talking about depression can come into play. And what inflammation does is it helps to promote tissue healing, and it helps bring everything back to normal. So really what inflammation also kind of is it's bringing in more cells, different types of cells from the immune areas of producing areas of the body to where that infection or damage is happening so that the right type of helper cells can help solve whatever issue is going on. And then we've got some innate immune system. So the innate immune system is really talking about more of the immune system in the central nervous system as compared to the rest of the body. So the innate immune system does recognize pathogens as well as damage associated patterns. So this could be like traumatic brain injuries or something. And with these innate immune systems, then their cells release certain factors that you're going to want to remember. And so some of these are nitric oxide and reactive oxygen species will be released to help with the inflammatory response. So these are toxic respiratory bursts to injured pathogens. So the nitric oxide and reactive oxygen species helps when you have some sort of sickness. Then you've got prostaglandins and thromboxanes. And these are generated by CPLA2s and the cyclooxygenases from lipids such as arachidonic acid. You don't need to know too much about that, but that's where those come from. Just fun fact. Something you guys have probably heard about a lot more, and is obviously present not just in the central nervous system, is cytokines. So these are systematic inflammatory response. And then you've also got chemokines, which recruit cells of the adaptive immune system. So cytokines and chemokines are proteins that are expressed following activation of pattern or damage recognition receptors. So again, you see these more in terms of an injury than a infection of some sort. So immune privilege, when we talk about immune privilege, what we're talking about is the central nervous system itself and how it's kind of privileged in that it's protected from a lot of diseases and stuff because of the blood-brain barrier. And again, a reminder, the blood-brain barrier is formed by astrocytes and endothelial cells that create a barrier between the central nervous system and the rest of the body, and doesn't allow very many substances, molecules to pass between it. So it helps protect the brain from becoming infected. And this innate immunity is very critically controlled by the glial cells. So the two main glial cells that we're going to talk about are microglia and astrocytes. So remember that glia specifically are the cells in the central nervous system that are not the typical neurons that we think of when we talk about neural cells. So glia are the helper cells. In Greek, it really means glue, and it makes up over 50% of the cells in the brain and the central nervous system are these glial cells. So these can be those microglia and astrocytes, but then also the oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system, as well as those Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system. There's been a view for a long time that glia cells provide structure and support for the neurons, which is really true. They actually do most of the work. So they help regulate homeostasis, synaptic plasticity, neurogenesis. They help guide and regulate development of new neuron cells, both glia and non-glial cells. And they also help regulate the activity-dependent refinement. So they really have a significant contribution to the adult brain and helping grow from a young brain to an older brain. And specifically, human astrocytes have actually been found to be very important in cognitive behaviors. There's actually been some studies where if you graft or transplant human astrocytes into a mouse brain, you actually see a significantly increased cognitive behaviors in the mice. And showing the importance of them, again, some pathologists studying Einstein's brains for clues to his abnormal intelligence also found an increased number of astrocytes, as well as larger astrocytes in general. So there seems to be some sort of connection or correlation between astrocyte number and size and intelligence. So here we're going to cover microglia specifically. There was a cool GIF, which apparently isn't working, but pretend there's a cool picture on the right side. So microglia is one of the two types of glial cells that's really focused on this immune response in the central nervous system. It's the primary immune cells, and it's derived from early embryonic hematopoietic progenitors. So it's really it's the only resistant cell type that's not derived from the ectoderm. And surveillance of the central nervous system is also conducted by the microglia. So that's pretty cool. You can see express pattern recognition in the receptors as well. I'll get into what that means in a bit. But that's another main factor of the microglia. So they also play the main role in mounting the foreign body response to pathogens or damage. In other words, they're the first responders of the glial cells in the central nervous system. So just keep in mind that microglia are a very versatile type of cell like I just mentioned, they have a lot of different roles, so they look very different. So on the left side, that everything in green, those are all microglial cells. But depending on what role they're doing, they're going to change their appearance to change with their function as well. So keep that in mind, and then that also helps to show how they're probably really involved in that synaptic plasticity and neurogenesis and cell survival by being able to adapt. So I mentioned this a little bit before, that microglia play a role in kind of remembering previous damage. So pretty much what I'm talking about here is that the microglia have some sort of, we'll call it a memory. So after a traumatic brain injury, then the cell will, be damaged, and if it's not fully resolved or fully fixed in the right way in a certain amount of time, then the cell will actually kind of remember that injury and will more easily be injured in the future or be more easily triggered back into that injured state. So what this image on top is kind of showing is you have a normal surveying microglia cell, say. After an injury, we've got some inflammatory markers. So the cell is going to go and try to help that the brain injury. And, if it's resolved in a timely manner, the cell is going to go right back to how it was before. But given time, if it's not able to resolve the issue in a quick manner, or if the injury is too big, then it will take too long to resolve the issue. And the cell will actually stay in this, what we call a primed state. So it's more at the ready in case something else happens in the future. So say there's an immune challenge or, some sort of sickness gets past that blood-brain barrier, the cell is now going to be hyperactivated. In other words, it's going to exert itself. It's going to over-respond to that immune challenge rather than just the normal activated state that it first was the first time that it was called into action. So this is going to play a role later on when we talk about what might be happening in depression. Now, the second type of cell that's very important in this immune response is the astrocytes. So astrocytes play a big role in the making up the blood-brain barrier, and it helps to regulate the intake of nutrients as well as oxygen to the brain. So again, it's very important. It also, regulates the blood flow, obviously with the blood-brain barrier. And there's also a very extensive signaling network between astrocytes. And so astrocytes, I always think, look like fireworks, kind of. There's so many branches. And so all of those branches are creating different synapses, and so they can form even more signaling networks and more connections. So that's really what's helping and could play a role in the potential increase in intelligence with increased size of astrocytes as well. That's one thing to look at. On the image on the right hand, you do see a human astrocyte, quite large, lots of branches, and then B, the smaller image, is a mouse astrocyte. And again, you see that there's not quite as much branching happening. So perhaps that increase in branching is what's increasing the cognitive load. Astrocytes also help to regulate the synaptic functions and contribute to plasticity as well. So they do kind of overlap in function a little bit with those microglia, but they more specifically focus on recycling glutamate and GABA back from the synaptic cleft back into other cells and helps break that down. And then astrocytes are more like the second responders, the backup responders to the microglia when there is an atrophin present or some sort of brain injury. So where microglia are the first responders, astrocytes are the backup that come in after. So as these astrocytes and microglia can do very good things for the brain and can help control inflammation and stuff, then inflammation can actually have some negative effects. So while the whole point of inflammation is to aid in the healing process, prolonged inflammation is actually a big problem and can cause serious brain issues. You see it a lot in neurodegenerative disorders such as ALS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, things like that. You see it in some stroke patients. And so what the images on the right are showing is just control patients that don't have any sort of neurodegenerative disorder. And then on the right side, you see patients that do have neurodegenerative disorder. So the top is ALS, the bottom is Parkinson's. And what it's looking at are the amount of inflammation. So you see an increased inflammation in these patients with these neurodegenerative diseases. And the problem with prolonged inflammation is that it can lead to apoptosis or cell death. And then what we see after that is a decrease in brain size, brain volume, and a decrease in brain function. So while some inflammation is good, too much or prolonged inflammation is bad. So we're going to stop it here. We'll continue on with more inflammation in the next video.